For my sister's wedding, our parents gave her a check for $120,000, but when I got married, Mom handed me just a cooking pot and said, "You'll have to earn the rest yourself." I was shocked and could no longer tolerate the unfairness. So I decided to take matters into my own hands, and the consequences shocked everyone. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. I still remember my sister calling me in tears after her engagement, telling me that my mom had already started making plans for her wedding. I tried to support her, but something inside me was burning, because I knew it would be completely unfair. The wedding day was surreal. Everyone was thrilled. My mom was beaming like she'd won the lottery, and she handed my sister an envelope with a check for $120,000. Yes, you heard that right, 120,000. My sister was jumping up and down, hugging my mom, and I sat with a glass of champagne trying to smile, but it was all a stretch. My mom glanced at the guests, then at me, and I felt something clench inside. I was getting married in a couple of weeks. My fiancé had warned me for a long time that my mom could be, well, weird about gifts, but I didn't think she'd be so specific. When my wedding day arrived, my mother handed me a saucepan, a real saucepan. No words other than, "You'll earn everything else." I froze because it seemed like time had slowed down. At first, I tried to laugh as if it were a joke, but her face remained completely serious. Everyone around me laughed. Someone tried to support me. "Oh, it's so practical." But inside, everything turned upside down. My husband and I went away on a short honeymoon, but I couldn't stop thinking about how my mother literally shoved a saucepan into my hands instead of helping me with my future. That evening, sitting by the ocean, I realized that this wasn't just a coincidence or a strange tradition. It was a signal. My sister got everything: money, attention, gifts, and I got a saucepan and a phrase that stuck in my head like a toothache. When I got home, I started noticing small things. How my mother constantly praised my sister, how she bragged about her wedding, and how I seemed completely absent from the picture. I tried to contain my irritation, but it grew. One evening, I found old letters my mother had sent my sister when she was still in college. They contained hints about how she always believed my sister was better, smarter, prettier, and that I shouldn't be relied upon. With each letter, something inside me boiled. But I knew that reacting angrily right now would give my mother complete power over me. I needed to come up with something that would make her feel at least a small part of what I felt. I started with small things, quiet at first, almost unnoticed by the family. For example, I began to react a little differently to her compliments to my sister, adding sarcasm, but quietly, almost invisible. Then I started putting off talking to her, even though I'd always responded immediately before. I considered every call or message as if it were a chess match, but it all seemed too soft, too quiet. And then I realized I had to up the ante. I wasn't going to take revenge harshly or publicly. No, it had to be something that would make her think and feel like her control was slipping away. I began quietly planning. First, I observed who she praised, who she ignored, what made her proud, what irritated her. Then I found a small hole in her system. She always believed she had complete control over the family finances, gifts, and decisions about events. She prided herself on this, as if it were her own superpower. I decided to slightly shake this myth so that she herself would feel disappointed. But it had to be done gradually. I started with small steps. I suggested, accidentally, mixing up my sister's birthday gifts, arranging a small detail so that she would be confused at first, and my mother would sense that someone was capable of making a move without her knowledge. Her reaction was almost comical, a mixture of shock and irritation. But that wasn't enough. I needed something more, something that would leave a mark and make her respect me, even for a split second. I realized that revenge isn't an instantaneous process. It's like chess played over many years. You arrange the pieces, plan each move, take a step back, only to strike unexpectedly. And the longer she believes she's in control, the more devastating your move will be. At this stage, I haven't yet revealed everything, haven't revealed the final plan, but I can already taste the chaos to come. Every family event, every meeting, every holiday becomes a playing field where I can carefully nudge events in the right direction. And most importantly, I started writing everything down. Every instance of injustice, every little detail, every glance and comment. I wrote without emotion, just the facts. This was important because emotional revenge often confuses you and makes you chaotic. and I was going to be a strategist. After that day with the saucepan, I sat at home, feeling simultaneously offended and irritated. But inside there was a strange feeling of energy, as if I had finally found a playing field where I could somehow impose my will. At first, I started with small things, completely mundane, seemingly unnoticeable at first glance, but every move was calculated. At the next family event, a dinner at my parents' for a casual occasion, I decided to slightly intervene in the organization, even though I was barely officially involved. At first, it was small details. I accidentally placed the dishes on the table in the wrong order, even though I'd checked beforehand where everything was supposed to be. The guests started to get a little confused, and my mother tried to correct the arrangement, but it looked funny, as if she'd lost control of the usual order. My sister constantly tried to prompt my mother, but every remark only exacerbated the awkwardness. Sitting with a glass of wine, I couldn't help but quietly laugh and internally comment on how control sometimes slips away. Then I decided to introduce one more detail. I accidentally mixed up the gift boxes the guests were supposed to receive. It was a purely minor detail. I swapped 2 envelopes and 1 bag of small items, too. The reaction was almost immediate. At first, Mom tried to hide her irritation, then she whispered a few disgruntled words to my sister, and those who received the wrong gifts were mildly surprised but didn't pay any attention. Inside, I felt a small sense of triumph. The first little chaos had been created, and no one had suspected me. The next thing I decided to do was a little bolder. I mistakenly placed the saucepan Mom had given me at the wedding in a prominent place, and with a sarcastic comment, quietly remarked, "A practical solution for future recipes," when someone glanced at the table. My sister blushed, Mom pursed her lips, and the guests chuckled a little. I saw that the blow had struck home. They noticed that I wasn't just observing, but knew how to add my own little touches. At subsequent family gatherings, I continued this strategy, but I became more careful so that no one could directly blame me. At one birthday party, I accidentally forgot to put my sister's gift in the correct envelope, even though I had prepared one in advance. This created a moment of confusion. My mother lost face, my sister was nervous, and the guests laughed, not understanding the whole point. I managed to keep the situation on the brink of chaos, enough to feel empowered, but not so much as to provoke direct conflict. I also started using family chats and social media. Not aggressively, but subtly. A few sarcastic posts and memes about generous parents, hints at the practicality of a saucepan, small photos of my own successes and independence. My mother saw it, and I enjoyed the thrill inside when I noticed her slightly losing control of how others saw her. My sister tried to comment, but it seemed forced, as if she herself was beginning to doubt the perfection of everything happening. At the same time, I continued to write everything down. Every expression on my mother's face, every awkward reaction, every little detail that might come in handy later. This fact base gave me a sense of confidence and allowed me to plot the next steps, as if I were orchestrating chaos. Each action was a small blow, but they gradually coalesced into a larger picture that my mother hadn't yet fully grasped. In one situation, I deliberately placed a dessert that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the party on a shelf and placed a pan from a wedding gift next to it, so that all the guests would casually see it. At first, my mother tried to pretend she hadn't noticed, but her gaze swept the room. My sister looked confused, and I smiled quietly. A small victory, and yet it was almost unnoticeable to outsiders, perfect for the Reddit lifestyle, chaotic and funny. I understood that this was only the beginning. Every step, every little thing was part of a long chain. I was building a sense of chaos, demonstrating independence, slightly irritating my mother and making my sister nervous. But most importantly, it all seemed natural, as if I was simply slightly shaking up the family order, not plotting revenge. At every family gathering, I continued to observe and adjust my actions, but now with a clear strategy. Small provocations, small chaotic situations, sarcasm and humor, a growing independence that was impossible to miss. I felt that small victories boosted my confidence and gave me a taste of future, more significant steps. Every family dinner, every holiday, even a simple meeting in the kitchen with my mother and sister, All this became a field for experimentation and strategic moves. I kept my thoughts to myself, but inside I was already plotting new provocations. How to embarrass the guests, how to gently tease my sister in front of my mother, how to make my mother feel like control was slipping away. At the same time, everything seemed natural every day, without drama or scandal, which made my actions even more effective. By the end of this period of small provocations, I realized the strategy was working. My mother began to show slight irritation, my sister was nervous, and I felt like an active participant in the events, not an observer. This gave me a sense of control and the understanding that big steps forward were real and possible. But for now, I kept them secret. The final plan for revenge had not yet been revealed, and all the actions seemed like random, everyday, chaotic moments, which perfectly suited the Reddit style, lifestyle, realistic and funny. Every event, every intervention became a natural part of my life, a small but growing escalation of chaos, where my mother and sister were already beginning to sense that not everything was going as they would have liked. And most importantly, I understood that the real victory was yet to come. While for now, all these small actions were creating the perfect foundation for the next step to be not only spectacular, but also completely deserved. When I learned that my parents were planning a large family dinner for their wedding anniversary, I immediately realized it was a chance to up the ante and test how far I could go with the little provocations I'd been preparing for the past few months. I knew that the little things I'd done before, mixed gifts, sarcastic comments, small awkward situations, had already created a little chaos, but now I needed a more tangible effect to make my mother and sister feel like control was slipping away. When we arrived, the house was filled with relatives, laughter, and noise, and I immediately noticed how my mother was trying to control every detail, making sure everything looked perfect, but it was already a struggle. I started with small steps. Accidentally, placing the envelope my mother usually gave with a gift in a prominent place, and discreetly placing a few receipts and photos nearby that might hint at a financial inequity between my sister's wedding and mine. My mother noticed with a glance that something was wrong, but she didn't say a word, and my sister tensed, trying to figure out what exactly I was doing. I left them in this tension and smiled to myself. During dinner, I carefully inserted my remarks into the conversation. Jokes about how parents sometimes like to give more to those closest to their hearts, comments about the practicality of gifts, hints about how small financial differences can create big emotions. It all came across as light humor, but everyone in the room sensed the tension and began exchanging glances. When it came time for the gifts, I pretended not to notice my mother handing my sister an envelope of money and quietly placed my saucepan on the table next to her. There was a slight pause, some giggles from the guests, and then I quietly said something like, "Well, practical, isn't it?" so that everyone would notice the contrast between the gifts. My mother blushed, my sister tensed slightly, and the guests had already begun whispering, discussing the situation. I felt the tension rising, but it still looked natural, as if it were an accident. Then I took the next step. I casually asked one of the aunts about my sister's wedding preparations and the financial aspect, deliberately bringing up the topic of money and gifts, so that my mother would feel the pressure in front of the guests. My mother tried to answer, but her voice trembled, and her every gesture betrayed her inner irritation. My sister tried to defend her, but the more she spoke, the more she seemed to be justifying the injustice. I continued to smile, pretending to be simply curious, and with each question, the chaos and discontent grew. One of the guests noticed the documents and photograph I had discreetly placed in a prominent place and asked quietly, "Is this related to the wedding gifts?" My mother tried to explain, but it seemed forced and false. The guests began exchanging glances, and I was inwardly delighted. The first elements of a scandal were developing naturally. At some point, I decided to enhance the effect of the financial symbolism. I accidentally mentioned the difference in the gift amounts, slightly exaggerating the details, so that the guests would begin to understand that the situation was not so simple. My mother tensed even more, my sister blushed, and some relatives began to discuss it among themselves. A mild drama escalated into a scandal, but it seemed natural, casual, without any direct accusations on my part. I added another small detail. Before dessert, I carefully placed the saucepan from my wedding on the table next to the documents and photographs, to visually enhance the contrast between what my sister received and what I received. My mother noticed but couldn't do anything about it. My sister laughed nervously, and the guests whispered, noting the strange discrepancy. Every detail was carefully calculated, not too obvious so as not to provoke accusations, but noticeable enough to create the effect of public drama. I also subtly paid attention to how the guests reacted to gifts and conversations about money, smiling and pretending it was just a mundane matter. The situation escalated. My mother tried to maintain control, but her every gesture seemed irritated. My sister was starting to lose confidence, and I felt like the whole plan was working. I carefully inserted jokes and comments that seemed like innocent irony, but made my mother nervous and my sister blush. As dinner came to an end, I became convinced that small financial and mundane provocations had created a scandalous effect. My mother felt awkward, my sister was nervous, and the guests discussed the situation among themselves, although no one could directly blame me. Everything looked like natural domestic chaos, mixed emotions, small jibes, and sarcasm that led to a powerful public drama. By the end of the evening, I sat with a glass of wine and watched my mother barely contain her irritation. My sister tried to smile, and the guests continued to discuss the situation. I realized that this combination of public scandal and symbolic financial blow worked perfectly. The effect was palpable. Emotions were high. The drama was intense, yet everything seemed realistic and mundane, which suited my revenge strategy. This was the first truly major step that demonstrated that my provocations were working, and I got a clear picture of how I could further escalate the situation without revealing my full intentions and maintaining control over events. After that family dinner, I realized I could no longer treat my mother the way I had before, and that her habit of giving her sister the best of everything and pretending I was fine was killing me inside. I decided it was time to start distancing myself and stop allowing her to control my emotions and events in my life, and this decision immediately gave my behavior a new direction. At first, I started with simple things: fewer calls, fewer messages. I used to answer them almost immediately, but now I'd delay them for a few days, and sometimes ignore them entirely when I realized she was trying to force her opinion on me or come up with new advice. Every time she called with questions about plans, gifts, or what needed organizing, I answered briefly and dryly, even a little ironically, pretending to be busy when in fact I could easily spare the time. I noticed her tone changing, first mild surprise, then irritation, and then attempts to manipulate me into returning to old habits and closeness. I was prepared for this and decided to proceed gradually so as not to completely derail the situation, but at the same time to make it clear that the boundaries were now mine. At the next meeting with my parents, I didn't arrive first, as I had before, but let my mother wait for a few hours. When I arrived, I didn't show any joy at the meeting, simply greeting her warmly and switching to conversation with other relatives, trying to show that my life and emotions were now under my control, not hers. My mother tried to intervene in the conversation, starting to discuss past events or gifts, and I gently, sarcastically, but firmly steered the conversation toward neutral topics, sometimes jokingly. "Oh, Mom, let's save that for the family grudge museum." And everyone got the hint, while my mother blushed and fell silent. I noticed that such small steps had an effect. She gradually began to understand that she could no longer force me to react the way she had before and that I needed my personal space. In everyday life, I began to limit joint shopping trips, evening get-togethers, and even participation in planning family events. Sometimes I would simply send messages like, "I'm busy today, maybe another time," without offering an alternative, to show that my choice was my decision, not hers. My mother would first try to understand what was going on, then try to make me feel guilty, saying, "What would I do without my mother?" Or, "You don't even see me." And I would respond with a slight smile and humor, but firmly, "Don't worry, everything is under control, life just goes on." These moments were important for me because I felt like I could finally put myself first and stop living by someone else's standards. The next steps were more noticeable. I stopped sharing every detail of my life with my mother, especially those events where I might feel unfair or compared to my sister. I scheduled meetings and trips, so that she wouldn't accidentally find out about them first, sometimes even inviting friends and relatives into my circle, bypassing her, creating the feeling that my life was developing independently. This became noticeable in the family. Relatives began to notice that I was communicating less with my mother, not taking the initiative in joint affairs, and although no one intervened directly, the tension grew. Every time she tried to intervene, I gently but firmly steered the conversation to other topics, sometimes humorously, sometimes with a touch of irony, but without aggression, showing that I was still polite but no longer allowing myself to be controlled. At the same time, I began to rethink traditions and shared rituals. I abandoned the habit of celebrating holidays in the old way, stopped accepting her advice about the house or gifts, even small things like how to set the table or what to cook. Each such step was a small victory over what had once been considered the norm, but now became a symbol of my independence. I felt that distance was necessary to restore inner peace and stop worrying about the injustices I had experienced since childhood. My mother gradually began to notice that I was changing, that her usual methods of influence weren't working, and this expressed itself in irritation, attempts at gentle pressure, and subtle manipulation. I responded with humor, sometimes irony, but firmly, and gradually this became the norm. She learned to accept my independence, and I learned not to react to her provocations. The key was that I did everything gradually, without abruptly ending the relationship so as not to create a family scandal, but at the same time demonstrating that my life and emotions were now completely under my control, and that her behavior no longer had power over me. This process lasted for weeks, sometimes months. Every call, every meeting, every family holiday turned into a test of my resilience and ability to maintain distance. And with each passing moment, I felt myself growing stronger, more independent and calmer, while my mother gradually realized that the old methods of influence no longer worked and that I could build my life on my own terms without her interference. All of this created a sense of a new order, where I decided who I would allow into my life and who I would exclude. Every little detail, every joke or sarcastic comment was part of this process, making it natural and mundane, yet consistent and noticeable to everyone involved. By the end of this phase, I felt that distance had been established, boundaries defined, and my life was finally beginning to belong solely to me, and this sense of inner freedom became an important part of my strategy. I had long noticed that my mother's constant interference in my life was like a red flag, and I simply couldn't tolerate it anymore, so I began actively distancing myself, but gradually, to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship, even though everything was already different inside. At first, I simply stopped sharing the details of my plans with her, where my husband and I were going for the weekend, what I was planning to cook, what I was shopping for the house. Every message or call from her about something needing to be discussed was now met with a short, calm response, sometimes with a touch of irony, so she'd understand her advice no longer carried any weight. But at the same time, I didn't want to create a scene. I noticed that each of these actions had an effect. Mom would become nervous, ask more questions, try to intervene, but I was already prepared for this and continued to behave calmly, as if it were her quirks, not my irritation. Ultimately, every conversation with her turned into a test of my new boundaries. I responded evenly, sometimes with a touch of sarcasm, sometimes simply steered the conversation toward neutral, everyday topics. This had a profound effect on her nervous system, as she had become accustomed to being able to provoke emotions in me with every word or remark. Over time, I stopped taking the initiative in shared activities and events. Now I was the one choosing when and with whom to meet, where to go, and what to discuss, and my mother sensed this immediately. She tried to control the situation, slipping in advice and questions, but I pretended these actions were unimportant and calmly ignored her attempts at influence. Even on a mundane level, I began to establish new rules. I ran the house, family rituals, and plans myself, disregarding my mother's usual directives. I did this so naturally that none of my friends or relatives perceived it as an open conflict, although my mother was seething with irritation inside. I stopped telling her important news, such as doctor's appointments, renovations, or large purchases, inviting friends or my husband to resolve matters without her involvement. Every time she accidentally noticed these changes, Her face expressed a mixture of surprise, irritation, and helplessness, which only reinforced my sense of control. I kept thinking that this was a small but important victory. I was reclaiming my space and demonstrating that I could build a life without her interference, and do so naturally, without open confrontation, yet with a noticeable effect. Sometimes I allowed myself a touch of sarcasm when my mother tried to intervene. I'd comment on her advice as interesting thoughts, pretending to listen, but in reality, I'd already made my own decisions. These moments gave me a sense of empowerment, while at the same time, my mother felt an internal discomfort, realizing that her usual methods of influence were no longer working. Gradually, I began to introduce distance into our everyday interactions. Fewer meetings with her, fewer calls together, minimizing household errands and conversations. I noticed that her irritation was growing with each passing day. She was trying to provoke me with small things, but now I no longer responded emotionally, only with light humor or sarcasm, which created the feeling that everything was under control, although in reality, this was a new order in the relationship. Over time, I also stopped discussing my husband's successes, my achievements at work, or vacation planning with my mother. I kept all of these things to myself and my close circle of friends and family, demonstrating that she was no longer part of my inner world and therefore had lost the control I was accustomed to. Each step was calculated to gradually make my mother realize that her influence had diminished, that she could no longer be the center of my decisions and emotions, a feeling that was painful and irritating for her, but liberating for me. I noticed how this changed the dynamic of our interactions. My family began to notice the change. Some were surprised, but no one interfered directly because I handled everything carefully, without open conflict. On a more personal level, I stopped asking her opinion about home renovations, furniture purchases, or holiday planning. I decided everything myself, occasionally allowing friends or my husband to point out that it was my choice, not her usual preoccupation. My mother tried to discuss past mistakes or gifts, hinting at injustice, but I calmly changed the subject or responded with a touch of irony to show that these issues no longer mattered. Over time, I felt the process of distancing itself become natural. My mother gradually realized that she was no longer the center of my life, that her usual methods of influence weren't working, and each new step in my behavior strengthened my sense of independence and control. I no longer felt internal pressure, didn't worry about comparisons with my sister or injustice, and every time my mother tried to intervene, I observed her reaction and felt a sense of satisfaction, because now her displeasure was obvious and my boundaries were firmly established. Every household decision, every conversation, and every plan now belonged solely to me, and I could calmly build a life where my mother no longer had the right to influence my emotions and decisions. All these months, as I gradually distanced myself from my mother, I understood that this was my revenge. Quiet, deliberate, domestic, without any big scandals, but with a tangible effect. And now the moment had come when I could fully appreciate the results. I stopped telling her about my plans, stopped sharing my successes at work, stopped including her in household decisions, stopped inviting her to my meetings and events. And each such action accumulated its effect. She gradually found herself no longer the center of my life, but merely an outside observer, and this shocked her. She didn't understand what was happening, and at first tried to intervene in the usual ways: calls, questions, advice, attempts to arrange meetings. But I responded evenly, without emotion, sometimes with a touch of sarcasm, sometimes simply ignoring her, and each time I saw her irritation and resentment grow. It was almost therapeutic for me, watching my mother, so used to controlling my every move, lose her influence, while I felt completely in control of myself and my life. Sometimes she'd try to engage me in conversations about the past, about gifts, about who gave what to whom, or about what was done wrong, and I'd always gently but firmly shift the subject to neutral matters or simply respond briefly, demonstrating that her words no longer held any power. I began to notice how her usual methods of exerting pressure completely collapsed, and she herself lost her balance. Sometimes she'd call several times in a row to check if I'd answer. Sometimes she'd inquire through relatives or friends, trying to find out what was going on, and each such moment was confirmation to me that the strategy was working. On a day-to-day level, I stopped including her in any household decisions, from planning holidays to small things like how to arrange the furniture or what groceries to buy. And I did so calmly, without visible anger, simply as a natural expression of independence. My mother seemed confused, her displeasure manifesting itself in fatigue, irritation, and constant attempts to understand why I was now so distant, but nothing she did could ever affect me the way it had before. I began living entirely by my own rules, scheduling time with my husband and friends, handling all household matters, organizing my own holidays and gatherings, disregarding her opinion and presence, and the feeling of control was incredible. At times, she tried to evoke guilt, reminding me of the past, of how she cared, of her love and effort. But I no longer reacted emotionally, only with mild sarcasm. Sometimes I'd reply with something like, "Yes, I know you've always tried, but now things are different." And this seemed to add fuel to her inner irritation, because she didn't expect her accustomed power to disappear so quickly. The most interesting thing was watching other relatives react. They saw that there was a rift between us, that I was keeping my distance, and at the same time, they understood that it was entirely my choice, and no one could accuse me of aggression or dramatization. Everything seemed natural. My mother tried to notice that her control was crumbling, tried to comment on my decisions, offer advice, but I simply smiled, went my own way, and did what I thought was right. A feeling of satisfaction grew within me. Every call, every question, every attempt at intervention confirmed that she wasn't ready for this situation, that her usual role had been shattered, and this feeling was sweet. I realized that revenge wasn't about violence, scandals, or public showdowns, but about showing that injustice and disregard for consequences leave their mark, and that my life is my life, not an extension of her control. Sometimes I deliberately shared my successes with friends and family, noting small victories and achievements so she would understand that she no longer influenced the events around me. Visually, everything seemed mundane. I laughed, joked, participated in ordinary activities, but at the same time I completely excluded her influence, and each such step was a step of revenge, quiet, careful, but tangible. I felt an inner freedom, calm, and control I had never experienced before, and this was the point of the whole strategy, not to destroy, but to show the consequences of her injustice and neglect. My mother reacted in different ways. Sometimes she tried to provoke a conversation about feelings, sometimes she asked through other people, sometimes she simply remained silent and observed. And each time, her reaction confirmed that my distance was truly effective, that she was unprepared for the fact that her own daughter could so easily, calmly, and confidently build a life without her. This feeling of complete control over my own space and emotions was the culmination for me, and for the first time I felt that I could build my life by my own rules, and not by the rules of my parents, that the feeling of inner victory and revenge finally became clear and tangible, and no one could challenge my independence anymore, and my mother was forced to come to terms with the fact that her usual role was destroyed, that her influence had disappeared. And this realization gave me an incredible feeling of triumph and inner satisfaction.